They'll archive it and everything. So we're great to go. Well, welcome to Keith. And it is a joy to welcome back into this space Will Shelton, for whom this space has meant so much. And I know you all mean so much to him. So I'm going to turn this over to Will. Will, welcome back. You remember how that works?
Can I wear it?
Yeah,
Am I allowed
around
to?
your ear and everything.
Can I put the... Well, listen, I used to get mildly annoyed when, not the senior pastor, but other guest speakers would come and it messes, Andrew, I'm going to mess with your ear hold thing here. So it's just part of the deal. Am I allowed to put my water on this? I've told Scotty and I told Dave. Josh was here earlier and I think he had to leave, but we early on in the gathering, Josh and I, because if you recall, there was a table and a white sheet and two really rickety things that we had fire on every week. And UMW offered to make us something, and some other folks offered to make us something, and I was always like, no, we're super stripped down. We're not doing anything. We want solid white. Josh and I went to a Hobby Lobby, but Hobby Lobby is relatively new here in Athens, right? So it wouldn't have been, it would have been maybe Walmart. Josh and I went to we looked at fabric for 90 seconds, and we were like, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this? And then we left. And so anyway, I always resisted, no, we want just all whatever. And the first time I saw this thing and this thing on Facebook, I was like, oh, that does look better. It looks so much better. And this is great over here too. That's awesome. This is a great room, and I love it so much. And if there's anyone here, there are some Presbyterians here. There are at least one Knoxvillian is here. So if there are people here that are that don't know us as well or whatever, we got married in this room. Covington was baptized right about here-ish by Dave. So I think Covington is in the sound booth. I hope, right? Granddaddy Austin's back there. So what I realized, I've gotten to do this a handful of times now, and when we put this one on the calendar, I realized that 90% of what I say when I do these things, I've said in this room at some point in time from 2012 to 2018. So I'm going to try to offer you something slightly different and maybe a little bit familiar as well. I will tell, even though we're live streaming this, I was going to tell this story. One of my favorite things that's happened with the book is a few weeks ago on election day. You may know we live in Virginia. We had a particularly contentious election for governor, so there was a big crowd at the poll, and we went down our voting places right across the street from our church. There's a big gym right across the street from our church, and we went there to vote. And Pulaski is a lot like Athens, is a small town, big enough, but still small, where people know each other and everybody knows each other. So you're in line to vote, big election, everybody's there. I was talking to 5 or 6 different people. And when I was walking up to the table where you show your driver's license, et cetera, a woman from my church came out the other way. She's 70 or 80, and she walked past, and I said, hey, and she said, hey, and without missing a beat, she said, I haven't been coming to church because I haven't been vaccinated. And I was not ready for that conversation right at that moment, because I thought, first of all, I have seen you in church. And second of all, there are all these things. You ever have these conversations where as soon as the conversation ends, you play out 7 different versions of it in your head that would have been better than what you actually said? So she said that, and I was something like, well, you're still welcome, but I wish you would, and then she just kind of walked off. And I was like, oh man, I was so flustered by it. And as soon as she walked away, there was a woman at the polling desk that I did not know. And as soon as she walked away, this other woman said, are you Will? And I said, yes. And she said, I read your book. And I was so flustered by that. She said, I read your book. And I said, congrats. So after that, there was no getting, I have no idea what she thought about the book because she wasn't willing to tell me, but I'm sure she went around Pulaski and told everyone, what a jerk the author is for saying any of those things. So I've gotten to do a handful of these now, but man, I have not looked forward to any of them as much as this one. So this is one of the best rooms on the face of the earth, and y'all are some of our favorite people, and we're very glad to still be connected and attached here. So let me just say a few words about like the why of it, and a couple of things that I've always like to point out about it. And then, Matt, I'd love to hear from you. Y'all had like several different small groups that went through it, and I know I told Pat Chester, wherever she is, that like it's really strange to teach your own book. Like Dave is teaching Andrew's book, right? Because yeah, this is a good move because it's super weird. Because when you stand up and teach your own book, and someone in the class, in my own church, when someone says, what about this? And it's hard to not just be like, did you read it? Like, I don't have a lot of bonus material like this. What I think is what I said. So I would love to hear from y'all. But let me say just a couple things. When I became a pastor, and some of this is in the book. When I became a pastor in 2006, I was 24. I'd lived in Knoxville my whole life. And I became a pastor like you do in Methodist world in the middle of June in 2006. And 10 days later, I started writing a sports blog. I missed talking to my friends about sports. I just missed it. And this is 2006. Facebook was a year old. There was no such thing as Twitter. Some of us were on MySpace back then. Shout out if you had a MySpace page in 2006 with some sweet music on it. Alex had a MySpace page, but we didn't know each other back then. I just started, it was a very like mid-2000s thing. I was like, hey, I emailed my friends and my parents and said, hey, that's how you put information out in the world back in 2006. And I said, hey, I've started this blog. I'm going to write about sports. I would love for you to read it and we could comment on it. And so I wrote at this site that I made myself for 2.5 years. It was mostly about Tennessee. I wrote about the Braves. If anyone wants to talk about the Braves after this is over, I'd be happy to do that too. Austin does not want to talk about that, but if anyone else wants to, I'd be happy to talk about it. I did that for 2.5 years. I was getting into seminary at that point in time and all this stuff. And after 2.5 years, like there were a few dozen people read it regularly. That was kind of cool or whatever. It got linked on ESPN.com one time. And I thought this was the greatest thing that ever happened in my life. And at the end of that year, this guy who's become one of my closest friends and colleagues, Joel Hollingsworth, that ran a website called RockyTopTalk.com, asked if I would come and write with them. And I said, no, I'm in seminary. I'm a pastor of these 5 churches. Like, I don't have time for this. And he waited a couple months, and then he asked me again. This was right after Lane Kiffin was hired. This is now a very long time ago. And I remember him saying something to me that has been very like freeing for me throughout, which is, because I was again giving him like, man, I can't meet any deadlines. I have funerals that are unpredictable in my church. Like the church has to be my whole focus, and I'm going to do seminary. And he said to me, we just want you exactly as you are now, just to come and write for us instead of something else. And there was something very freeing about that to me. So right after Lane Kiffin was hired, which is a very chatty time in Tennessee sports world, if you remember back that far, I started writing at that website. And I wrote for that site from December of 2008 for about 8.5 years. Started getting on the radio the year after that, and like that thing just took off. We moved, well, there was no we at that point in time. I moved to Keith in 2012. Knew Alex, but we weren't together. While I was here, I never really talked about this because I never wanted anybody to ever think like, hey, he's spending any amount of time on that's taking away from this. But like the last year we wrote at that site, and which was the fall of 16, we're reaching like 250,000 people a month on that website, just about Tennessee football, which is of no surprise to you. In Virginia, they don't think that's so cool, but we were reaching all of these people. And then Joel had a falling out with the higher-ups, and he walked away from it in the spring of 17, and we were pregnant, and there was a lot of life change happening. And I knew that, like, if I stayed, it was going to be much less fun, and I was going to get asked to do a lot more, 7 reasons why this coach should be fired, or whatever, just stuff I didn't want to do, stuff I didn't think was fruitful, but stuff that people would click on. And so We left that site. I still write for a much smaller site, much less regularly. But anyway, I had this thing of like, there's other stuff I can write about. And there's other stuff I can write about, I know from doing this and standing in this room every Sunday, that matters a whole lot more than what is Tennessee's left tackle doing on Saturday afternoon. That stuff is important, but it's not the most important thing. So, that was 17. I've like started my own blog. I wrote there regularly. There was a whole season where what we preached in here on Sunday morning, I always turn here because that's where the screen is, where I'm like, here's where what we preached in here on Sunday morning, I would write there sometimes, but it was hard, like it was never consistent enough. And so then we moved to Pulaski, and I just had this sense of there's things I want to say, but I don't know how, and I would hem and hedge and this sort of stuff. And then finally, at Christmas 2 years ago, my lovely wife, for Christmas in 19, my sister is an editor in Atlanta. And what Alex got me for Christmas in 2019 was essentially a down payment with my sister to write a book. So none of this happens without Alex, but especially in the same way that my friend Joel saying that to me all those years ago about just be who you are and do what you are, like that was incredibly permission giving. So I met with my sister in January of 20. She came up from Atlanta. We had a whole whiteboard. We spent like 8 hours together and outlined this book and all of this stuff. And I had always I was fascinated with this idea of how do we communicate the most basic truths? Because in Methodist world, we move around. So we get a lot of chances to make first impressions. We get multiple chances in our lives and our careers to stand in front of a group of people for the first time and say, here's what I got, right? Like, here's what you should know about me, and here's what you should know that I believe about God. And standing in this room in June of 2012, we did a series in August. I saw Denny Humphreys last week. And he came up to me and said, remember that sloth thing? So I'm glad to know for some of y'all that are longtime pieces of this puzzle. But we did that in August when I worked here. But before we did the 7 Deadly Sins, the very first series that I ever preached here was a 5-week series called Roots of Eden. And Josh Stevens and I worked together. If you've been here, back then, there was like 90 people in this room. And if you were here that day, you might remember one Sunday where we put aluminum foil on the doors and turned all the lights off and talked about let there be light. It's meaningful to me to say that in this room, to know like this really is the stuff I think you should do first, because it's what we did first here, way back in June of 2012. It was a 5-week sermon series back then, but that's where I believed is where you should start. I didn't start there in Pulaski because we had general conference nonsense and other stuff, so we ended up doing stuff that was much less fun. But anyway, I started writing on this and working on it in January. And then in March, the pandemic happened. And I had 2 chapters done. And I thought, well, this is not for right now. Right? Because we got to figure everything else out. We were in the 3rd trimester with Sophia, who's doing great back there, by the way. Everything was it just felt like this needs to be put on hold. And I don't know, everybody's had a different experience and every church has had a different experience, but one of the things that helped us the most in the pandemic was being pregnant, because personally, I don't recommend being pregnant in the pandemic at all. I'm sure Alex doesn't recommend it either. But professionally, it was so helpful for us because we had to go slow and be even more cautious. And so what it meant is we got to watch a lot of other churches try things before we did and see this works and this doesn't and all that other stuff. But the most profound thing was just because of the baby, because we talk about this more some other time, we had a minor league baseball stadium we used on Wednesday nights. We had a lot of unique advantages. But I sat in my living room every Sunday morning for 55 Sundays in a row and pushed go live on Facebook and hoped that someone would show up and watch. And it worked. And that was surprising, but it really worked. And so there was this, even in the middle of the pandemic, there was this momentum of I feel like God was saying, this is worth, the things we're trying to put out in the world are worth continuing to pursue. So after about a month in the pandemic, I sat back down. I did it on Fridays. I wrote it on Fridays until Sophia was born. And then after a couple months, I wrote it Thursday mornings from 6 to 9 a.m. I keep waiting for somebody to tell me that the second half of the book is not as good as the first, because the second half of the book was written from 6 to 9 a.m. on Thursday mornings once a week. It is, any of y'all that know me really well or have stepped in my office for 2 seconds or seen Andrew's compared to it, know that like order is not my thing, but it was the most like disciplined thing that I have ever done in my life. So I just am incredibly grateful. The most meaningful thing to me about it is seeing churches take it on and read it and be challenged by it and ask good questions and say things where you think like, oh, I've never thought about that. I'll say two more things and then I would love to hear from you all. The story I always tell, and I told this story the first Sunday I was here, is I used to work in Christian bookstores before I was a pastor. So I know this world a little bit, even though there really aren't many Christian bookstores that are still open now. But when I was a freshman in college, just after losing my scholarship, if you've read the book, I got a job at Limestone Books in Westtown Mall, right next to Middlebrook Pike United Methodist Church. Some of you may remember Limestone Books. Somehow the Christian bookstore in Westtown had the best location in the mall. They built that if you know Westtown, they built that Funscape movie theater. And when you came down the escalator from the movie theater, the first thing you saw was the Christian bookstore. It was amazing. The Great American Cookie Company was on one side and Annie Ann's Pretzel Place are on the other side. Businesses that survive any kind of change in the mall. That place, like, I ran cross country and track in high school, and then I worked there a year later, and my life has not been the same since. It smelled like the pearly gates in that bookstore. So I worked there, and then I was a youth director for a minute, and then I worked at Lifeway in Turkey Creek, which is also closed, I think. But while I was there, there was a book that came out by an author named John Ortberg called If You Want to Walk on Water, You Got to Get Out of the Boat. Maybe you came across that book. This is probably 20 years ago now. And so Ortberg was popular. We put Ortberg's book out there, and we also put his previous works out there. And there was a book that he wrote earlier called The Life You've Always Wanted. And people would come into this bookstore, and instead of picking up his new book, they would be drawn to The Life You've Always Wanted. So, I mean, it's catchy, right? It's compelling, and they would always be drawn to it. And what was so fascinating to me about that is, do you know who shops in Christian bookstores? It's Christians, right? Like occasionally we would get someone who didn't realize it was a Christian bookstore and thought it was like Barnes and Noble, and you ever done the thing where you step in somewhere and then you realize you're in the wrong place, but you're too embarrassed to just turn around and leave, so you pretend to shop for a minute? We'd get some of that occasionally. But almost exclusively, if you are in a Christian bookstore, you are a Christian. And so there was this sense of like, why are so many Christians drawn to the idea of the life they've always wanted? Because shouldn't we be living it already? And that has always stuck with me. And in every church I've ever been in, I've been in small rural churches. I've been the associate pastor at this church. I'm the pastor of a mid-sized church now. No matter the dynamic, no matter the situation, our churches are still full of people that I think are looking for ways to connect. Or maybe looking for ways to reconnect. And through a pandemic, when if you were going through the motions, then all the motions got taken away, then I just feel like there's something there that we can offer. And if you're going to start over, which in so many ways we've had to do through the pandemic, do we still trust the story? Can we still start in that place? And then the other thing I'll say is I'm so grateful. Like they're all kind of sitting in the same place, but like a lot of the people that helped me in this process, Amy Sullins read the book and wrote a review for it. Kelly Borwick is not here, I don't think, but she did that. Brandy, of course, did an awesome job on the cover. Brandy will not sign your book, but you should try to make her anyway. So this is a great church. This is a great church that still, when I see Denny Humphreys, Harrison Hart texted me today, Laura Lambert, Laura McLean, like, this is a great place. And it is great in part because of the way you build relationships and things like that. But let me say a word about Denise Cunningham as well. If you've read the book and you're like, is Denise based on a real person? Yes and no. When my sister and I were putting this book together, my sister's a fantastic editor in part because she's not impressed with me whatsoever. So like she's really good at taking out stuff that is like not emotionally attached. My sister and I also have like the very same sense of humor. So there are things There's a joke in, I think, the second chapter about the evening news, where the local news is not poetry, right? It's, if it was, good evening, good evening, I'm Chet. We're so glad you've joined us. Top story tonight: your mom might be homeless. And the Lutheran pastor in our town did the book, and she was like, I don't think that's funny at all. But I was like, well, it's not a homeless joke. It's really supposed to be like a your mom joke. But apparently, only my sister and I think that's funny. So, but anyway. My sister said something very helpful to me, which is, who's the audience for this book? And please don't say Christians, because it needs to be more specific than that. And so she said, think about people that you feel like have really connected with something you were doing. So we got a whiteboard and we wrote all of these names of people in Ceres and here and in Pulaski. And I say this to say, on behalf of myself and Dave, Bruce, and Andrew, like, we know who the good listeners are. When we stand up here, like, if you are a good, active listener, it means so much to us. And so, like, I wrote down some names from Ceres, and then I wrote down Shauna Hart and Leanne Liner and Drew Barton, who is a student at Tennessee Wesleyan. He's a youth director now. He used to sit right over here on the front row with a group of college dudes that sat on the front row in this service. And Bob Borwick and Denise Cunningham. And we had all these names of all these people, and then we just started pulling out, like, some of those, like Shauna is a unique name, so we didn't want to use her and whatever. And we got down, and I'm so sad the Borwicks are not here tonight. We got down to the end, and we had Denise and Bob. And we were like, well, Bob is like, do we want this to be just a generic, Bob is a more generic name. Bob Foster's here, right? So Bob is a more generic name. Or do we want this character to really have some personality, which is more about Denise? So we ended up going with Denise, which is so ironic because Bob Borwick is like the least generic human being I've ever met in my life. But so we ended up going with that. So I say that to say, one, Denise is an excellent sport for letting me include her in this. But two, man, if you are a good listener, we love you to death. And sometimes when we stand up here, it's not going the way we thought it would go. Or we didn't get enough sleep last night because our kids were up or whatever. And just seeing like an active listener on Sunday morning, it means the world to us. And like, we know. I can write those names on the whiteboard from everywhere I've been since then. So we really appreciate that. And we love you guys, and I appreciate you. And I would love to hear, I'll be happy to answer any question that you want. That story about flunking out of college, Dixie Liner, I told that story in the gathering one time, and Dixie Liner, when I'd go out to eat with her, because if you remember, Dixie was like eating at some function basically like 7 times a week, where she was being invited or honored in some sort of way. After I told that story about flunking out of college in the gathering, Dixie would introduce me to people and say, "This is Will, tell that story about flunking out of college." I feel like we don't lead with that. Like we don't lead with that at all. But I would man, what do you want to talk about? Anybody, anything? I get a good sweat going. I'm ready. Yes, I will say it's already happened once tonight. One of the things that's happened when I've told that story or in writing the book is people will come up to me and say, "Oh, my son, oh, my grandson, oh, my..." When you're going through something like when you're deep in the trees, one of the things about it, and if you made straight A's in college, you might have another area in your life, but like when you're deep in the trees, it feels like the thing you are doing is worse and different than anything anyone else has done before, and surely no one will ever understand this. And it turns out 18 to 24-year-olds are kind of dumb and make, a whole litany. But so for one, that's been a common experience for me. I have found, I was just talking about this in a trustees meeting last night at my church. When you lie to everybody in your life for about it was about 9 months where I lied to literally everyone. The result, the thing that has done for me is just make me err on the side of transparency, even when it's disadvantageous to do so. At our church, we're getting ready to build. We've combined our contemporary and traditional worship post-pandemic, and we're trying to figure out if that's a good fit. We need to build a platform for the praise band, and to do that, we need to tear out 2 pews. And it's my nature now to just tell everybody, hey, we're going to tear out 2 pews. And my trustees chair was like, why would you tell everybody that? Like, don't tell the people that need to know that, but just don't like. So I think that is a result of the choices that I made. Like, I find, for me personally, like, the way to just do it is just be like, I don't know, I'm just going to tell you this. But I think the other part of it too, for me, is, now that's half of my life ago. I'm 40. Which is not impressive to some of y'all in here, but it's impressive to me. So, I like the person that helped me become, but I would not have told that story. Even when I told it here, I didn't tell it here until year 3 or so. It was before you came. Yeah, I mean, it was not, yeah. So, vulnerability, Andy Crouch, who's in my book and has done some other things, talks about we need meaningful action and meaningful risk, but vulnerability can also be a weapon. Like, you can use vulnerability to manipulate people. So I don't think there's anything manipulative about flunking out of college multiple times, but yeah.
Always been the straight A's, the perfect, going to school, understanding and stuff. So I remember you talking to youth and them all sitting there going, wow, real messed up. I mean, it was
I'm glad I was at a look at him stage. Yeah, the way I tell it, like, to youth now, is to say that when we have kids graduate from our church, is to say you need somebody in your life that you can tell anything to. And that may not always be your mom or your dad, depending on what the thing is. You need somebody in your life that you feel like you can tell anything to, and that person is not going to, leave you for it. Or it's you need friends. It's been interesting for me to hear from friends of mine that knew me back then, since I wrote that book. They will say things like, man, we knew something was going on with you, but none of us knew. I mean, we were all 20. We don't know anything. Like, none of us knew how to talk about it, that sort of thing. Gratifying to hear, other people say, well, I didn't get my life together until this or whatever. But we need people we can be naked with. And that may not always be the same person for the same thing. But yeah, man, you need somebody you can say anything to, for sure. What else? What else you got?
What really touched me about reading your book was a new word that I've been trying to put in my vocabulary is fruitfulness. It really runs well with me.
I think fruitfulness, one of my friends, she's preached here before, Misty McCreary is one of my closest friends. She knew me when I was flunking out of college. She's the associate pastor at a large church in Kingsport now. She was in seminary with me. Her husband, Chris, is a great Hebrew scholar. And we were preaching a series on sexuality at our church where we are now. And I just remember asking him, look, before we go any further, is it theologically appropriate to make a distinction between be fruitful and multiply? Like, what is this verse about? Because like if you're talking about sexuality, you should start there. That's the first thing God says to people. So what is this about? Is this just about procreate, or is this about something else? And to me, when you track the fruitfulness narrative through the Bible, it's clearly about much more than procreation and literal multiplication. And I just find, one, that is, it's a healthier metaphor than in church world. Like, don't get me wrong. And I mean, y'all know, like, I love growth. I think things should grow. I think healthy things should grow. I think that matters. But that can easily be an idol to any of us. But fruitfulness just can look all kinds of different ways. And there's so many different kinds of fruit. So what fruitfulness is in one person's life doesn't have to be what fruitfulness is in another person's life. What fruitfulness is in one person's church doesn't have to be what's fruitful in another person's church. What's fruitful in this room doesn't have to be what's exactly fruitful downstairs. But this idea that is it healthy? Does it taste good? Can it multiply? Can it be shared with others? And I just think, again, if we're talking about where do we start, how do we approach this with people that may have never heard it before, how do we reignite somebody that's been going through the motions, whatever the case may be, the idea that the first thing God says to a person is be fruitful is just, I mean, I'm biased, I wrote the book. I think it's super great that the first thing that God says to people is be fruitful. And that as a starting point, because so many of the conversations that I have had, and I bet if you asked the rest of us, we would say the same thing. In our careers, so many of the conversations we've had about Genesis 1, 2, and 3 have been about creation versus evolution, or skipping ahead to Genesis 3 and what a sinner you are. And I'm not here to deny that we're all in need of grace. You should take the microphone from me if I try to do that. But the starting point between God and people is be fruitful. And that's a healthier message than be happy. It's a healthier message than be prosperous. It's a healthier message than grow. And fruit can look different. And fruit is seasonal, too, at the same time. Like, it's just such the Bible, do we trust the story? The Bible knows what it's doing. Like, it's just such a healthy, rich metaphor. So I appreciate you saying that. I think I have tried to frame that in my own, the way we talk about it at our church is how is this bearing fruit for us? So yeah, thank you for that. So if you got a question back there?
Well, I've got two questions.
Okay.
One, following on that, when you think about fruitfulness, do you think about bananas?
I do not think about bananas. I was telling Bev that earlier I appreciate, where'd you go, Bev? Bev's not in here. She's probably cleaning up. I appreciate that Bev said I know there are things that Will doesn't eat because I'm such a picky eater. That really endears me that you remember that. Tomatoes is usually what gets me with things. But I really think bananas are the worst. I think artificial banana flavor is like straight from the devil. Like a frozen banana popsicle is like the worst thing I could possibly imagine to eat. So, but I would be in error to say that maybe not artificial banana flavor, but I would be in error to say that bananas are not fruit, right? Just because it's not something that I enjoy, I would be foolish not to say that it's not fruit. And I think that's important too, is again, what's fruitful in my life isn't always what's fruitful in yours. Yeah. But how many, here's what I like, let's not get off on this. How many different flavors of popsicles do you have, is my question is. You have 4, it's 1 out of 4. You got cherry, and orange.
See, that's why I asked that question. Oh, man. So the second
Dave doesn't disappoint ever, like with the
question is, so this is like Genesis 1 through 3.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole lot of the Bible there. So are you working on anything else beyond that, or any other kinds of things?
I told that long story about writing for the blog at the beginning to say, like, I don't know how to do this job and not do that. And not just write about Tennessee. I like that that's there for me to do. Like, I write about Tennessee now whenever I want to, but I don't know how to do this job and not write. So we might get a little more clear of, again, I don't recommend newborn baby and 2 kids in the pandemic and 4 hours from all your family. I don't recommend that. And Alex carried some weight on this far more than just writing a check to my sister at the start. So like we might get a little clearer of, life getting back to whatever normal is going to be. But yeah, I love doing it. I love sitting down every Monday morning and looking at my computer screen with that cursor. Because like we plan sermon series, right? But on the specifics of what I'm going to say, I sit down every Monday morning and look at that cursor blinking at me. And I love that so much. Like I have loved it for 16 years. And I think some of that's the same. It's like the same, Andrew could speak to this. Like it's the same, it's like a different, it's the same muscle, but maybe you're using it in a different way or exercising in a different way. I think.
I have to say that if you look at Genesis as God speaking to us, that you kind of presented it in that way, and some of us maybe had never thought of it in that way. And in doing that, you introduced us to some concepts that we hadn't heard before. We hadn't heard God's voice say those words in the way that you described. So I welcome the time that you can explain what Jesus is talking about sometimes.
Well, here's what same thing, and that's why I love being in this room. The first Sunday I was here, and the first Sunday I was at Pulaski, the first thing I talk about is the first thing Jesus says. In the Gospel of Mark, oldest gospel we have, we thought it was Matthew, which is why Matthew's first, but we really think it's Mark now. The first thing Jesus says in the very first gospel we have is, the time is now. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the good news. And see, I think that frames everything Jesus is going to do. The kingdom is the thing Jesus talks about the most, so it's not just a one-off thing that he does. But again, how many Christians on the face of God's green earth need to hear the idea that this thing is for your life now, and not just for what happens to you after you die? And somehow that message, at some point, at least in my generation, in my lifetime, got skewed, which, like, as I always say, I don't want to go to hell either. Like, I'm not opposed to not going to hell, but from the beginning, the first thing Jesus says is, the time is now. He says it early. That shows up early in Matthew, early in Luke, and then John. And we do a lot of John in the book, tying it in with Genesis. But like that's there's a I'd have to look it up to quote it to you. There's a Jewish principle of like the principle of first occurrence, that when something shows up for the first time in Scripture, it carries weight the rest of the way. I appreciate the head nod, so like I'm not drifting into heresy. Y'all let me know. When something shows up the first time, other occurrences of that word carry some echo of that first occurrence in Hebrew. So when like with Sabbath, when holy shows up attached to Sabbath, it's this idea that we really are talking about something set aside, set apart. Take this day and set it over here. That's the context for holy and the rest of this thing. So anyway, yeah, I think that is my favorite way, and it's literally what I start with 6 years apart here and in Pulaski, is to say, look, the first thing Jesus says is the time is now. And if that message has been lost in your life, you might be the sort of person who would walk into a Christian bookstore and be attracted to the idea of the life you've always wanted. I always say, by the way, incidentally, that book by John Ortberg is about spiritual disciplines, so nobody bought it. When they walked into the bookstore and they picked it up, they were like, oh, the life you've always wanted. And then they open it up and it's about prayer, fasting, reading your Bible every day, all that stuff. Nobody bought it because we don't want the life we've always wanted if that's the way you get it. So anyway.
I'll just say, I think another thing that we really enjoyed was, there were two highlights that we had some fun with. Which first, one is more important than the other, but this whole concept of God did not create the darkness. I really enjoyed talking about that. And the close reading, which how many times have we read Genesis or heard it read or recited it or whatever, referred to it, and yet we just didn't know that snakes once had legs. I mean, just, where did the legs go? And, we had like a 10-minute conversation about snakes once had legs. And, they all tried. So I love the close reading, and we did talk about like if God didn't create the darkness. I mean, I love to talk about those
I think, again, like that's why the framework with Denise of if you were giving this to someone for the first time, it had no content, which is almost impossible to do. But we do. I mean, we do it with children every day, right? So the sense that we come with the whole thing prepackaged. Brian Mclaren, some of y'all may know Brian Mclaren. He wrote a book called A New Kind of Christian about the same time that John Orgelberg was writing those books 20 years ago. But anyway, I heard him speak one time. I think we did this here in a gathering too, where he talked about puzzles. And said that what's the most important piece in a puzzle? No one's gonna. I love when someone says the last piece because that's such a good answer, but it's wrong. It's not. But I love that's such a hopeful, like that's such a good sermon by itself. It's not the corner. It's not the last piece. It's the lid, right? Because the lid shows you what the puzzle is supposed to look like. Now I hate puzzles. I think they're dumb and foolish. And am not good at them. Like already Covington has advanced to the ones where I'm like, hang on a second. Let me try to see if this goes here. But the truth is, if you love puzzles, my sister adores puzzles. If you love puzzles, the truth is, if you trust the pieces, you could work it without the lid, right? And really, probably, if you're a person who loves puzzles, you would get more out of working the puzzle that way. We did do this in the gathering because I remember it was in that same series maybe, and Leanne Arbuthnot, like one of the first ways she got to know me is I was like, I need to expense 2 children's puzzles, please, for Sunday morning. And then we took the pieces and mixed them in wrong boxes, and like 3 people had a heart attack because they didn't like that at all. But Mclaren was saying, so many of us, we all come to the Bible with our own lids. We all come to it with, this is what I think it should look like, especially a familiar passage like Genesis 1-3. But the truth is, if you trust the pieces, you can work it without the lid. And sometimes particular lids about creation versus evolution, or especially original sin and fallenness, sometimes that'll force you to try to jam some pieces together that don't go exactly the way you think they do. So there's this invitation, I think, in reading it slow, or just trying to imagine. If we were giving this to somebody for the first time, if we really did have that conversation and say, if aliens landed and how do we talk to them about our faith? And we would all argue and disagree about what we should say. And then if someone said, let's give them a Bible, we would at least pause and think that might be a good idea. And if we did just give it to them and they read it slowly, like they had never seen it before, I hope, like that's the presupposition of the book, is they might see some things in here that we have missed because we've read it too many times, or the first time it was handed to us with a lid. Look, I mean, kids are the best example of this. I was at we had a storytellers convention in the conference a few weeks ago, and I went to that, and we got to put us in small groups, and they said, tell everybody what the first Bible story you remember hearing as a kid is. And you know what everybody says? First Bible story you remember hearing as a kid? Noah's Ark, right? Because there's animals in it. That's a terrible story to tell to children. What happens in that story? And when we go back to darkness, like you have to reconcile, right? And we try to do this in the last chapter of the book, but you have to reconcile. God does not create the darkness with what happens in that chapter, which in the Genesis narrative is told as their wickedness brought this on or whatever. But we hand that story like immediately as the first thing we hand to our kids with this glossy lid of animals. That's not what you put those pieces together, that is not a story for children. Not remotely is that a story for children. But it's just kind of in our nature, I think, to do those things. But if you trust the pieces, and y'all as a group of people that came out here on a Wednesday night to listen to this are people who I think at least want to trust the pieces. A person walking into a Christian bookstore to pick up that book, if they're stepping foot in the bookstore, there's at least some part of them that wants to trust the pieces. A person who didn't go to church for a year because of the pandemic or various health issues or whatever, and who maybe still, we got him in my church, I'm sure you got him here, that maybe still has not come back inside these doors in this room or that room for more than once or twice. Those people are still maybe looking for the pieces with some idea that they might still be able to trust them. And that, I think, is where we're at as people of faith, to try to communicate this message in new and fresh ways, that God does not create the darkness, that God still wants you to be fruitful, and that these things have always been true. I'm not here to do new truth, right? That's a terrible idea. We want to do old truth in new ways. And so, yeah. I'll stand right here and sweat and preach as long as you want me to, because I got the muscle memory. So
light and darkness, because that's something that you talked about many, many times. Just let me think about you a little bit.
Susan, I appreciate that. I think, yeah, like that, again, that's a central metaphor for the text, right? So it's not, when we talk about principle of first occurrence, it's not, we have to do better than it showed up once, but then it never shows up again. Like light shows up consistently throughout the story as a consistent metaphor. Anything else? Anything anybody read where they were like, I don't know about this. I need that stuff. Did you, people that taught it, I'll be vulnerable with you here for a second. People that taught it, did you use the discussion questions a lot? Yes. Andrew, did you use them a lot? Yes. Where's Nancy? Nancy, you used them a lot? Do you know when I taught it in my church, I used them almost never. Because I had workshopped the material in the book standing in this room and being other places, but the discussion questions at the end were just kind of theoretically, this might be a good idea. And then when I taught it myself, I was like, doesn't go the way I thought it was going to go. So I'm thrilled. I'm super glad to know that was good and helpful. Oh yeah? Okay. Would it have been more helpful to have the questions at the end of each chapter than at the end of the book? Semantics.
We had a conversation about, I kind of didn't love the last chapter because I wanted it to end after 11. Like,
Really?
I didn't want to jump to Jesus. I wanted to stay. We talked about this a little bit. I was like, oh, no, not Jesus, not yet. Like, I don't know. I wanted like a little more cushion or something.
I feel like, so the conversation I had with my sister is, should this be 10 chapters or 12? And she was like, why can't it be 11? And as a preacher, I was like, 11 doesn't make any sense. It needs to be 10 or it needs to be 12. It can be 10 with an introduction and an epilogue, but like it can't be 11. That doesn't make a lick of sense. And I'm interested to hear you say, because 11, like that framework of the question, most men tend to ask themselves, am I good enough? And most women tend to ask themselves, am I desirable? That stuff, that comes from a conversation in a seminary class that I was in on family discipleship. It was the best seminary class I ever took. And when I signed up for family discipleship, I did not anticipate it being the best seminary class I ever took. Andrew, did you have Chris Kiesling at Asbury? Yeah? Did you take that class? Yeah. Yeah, and it was just like in a small group in that class. That dude, Chris Kiesling, is the best. Like he could remember everyone's name after the first class. He was amazing. But that just kind of came out of conversation or whatever. But it didn't, like to me, it didn't feel right to just be like, by the way, you're going to ask these questions. See you later. My sister is Southern Baptist that edited the book. And so like while we were doing the editing process, we had all these note cards and she wrote on one of these note cards, where is the gospel? And if you've been in a Baptist church, you can appreciate that. And so I was like, yes, okay. I feel like sometimes in preaching, I can be guilty of this. Maybe we're all guilty of this, of like, all right, today I've talked about the feast of blah, 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 but in the last 3 minutes, let me give you some Jesus in here. You know? Like we feel like compelled to be like, here's part 3 of my series on Esther, also Jesus. But so like we worked really hard on not making that too long, that last chapter too long. And I wanted to go back and tie in the Indiana Jones in there as well, because I think that's light, that's illumination. By the way, Doug and Margie Jones are not here, right? Because they better not come after they said they had never seen Star Wars in your Sunday school class. Like it's grounds for dismissal from this church. So no. Ask them if they came. We preached that at Advent. Like maybe they just weren't here. That's that whole series. I'm like, what a failure. Didn't get them to watch Star Wars. Yeah, like I think that's you're married to a preacher. You know all this of like, we feel it's okay to present people the gospel. We don't want to do it out of obligation. That's like law language. But how everything has to be pointing, for me, like everything still's got to go to resurrection. Just does. Because if we don't have resurrection in there, our common need for grace needs grace. Like it needs grace. And so, but yes, that is not, you're the first person to tell me you wish I had stopped at 11. I've had, that's so fascinating to me. My favorite piece of feedback, there's a English professor in my church now, and I had her, like Amy Sullins, I had her read it beforehand. And I met with her, she said, come to my house. And I thought, oh God, like she's going to tell me, this is like 2 weeks before it comes out. I was like, she's going to tell me it's bad or whatever. And we had this great, it's my favorite conversation I've had about this book. Tonight's pretty high on the list, but at the end, she said, why do you assume, your assumption in this book is that Denise, even coming from another place, would never have heard or had any experience of this God? Why do you assume that? Because if God is God, then how hasn't she somehow had some kind of experience of this God? And I thought, dang it, that's pretty good, right? So I've really enjoyed like hearing things and people. And I've heard like I did one at Kodak United Methodist Church, and there was a guy there, and he was like, the alien thing is not doing it for me. And I was like, fair enough. That's like I get it. So anyway, yeah, but that's good. That's I've heard that too. Of like, are we landing this plane the right way? Yeah. It sounds like a Michael Scott. I don't know how many people are office people in here, of like, what's your greatest weakness as a preacher? I try to give him too much Jesus. It's like a Michael Scott answer to that question. Anything else?
You just had in your whole, when you were summing up the conclusion, if you just had 5 minutes to best describe who God is, what better way to describe God than through Jesus?
Right. And I think if you follow the John narrative, if you had 5 minutes to describe who God is, there's no better way to describe God than Jesus. So like that's the John, when John 1 is echoing Genesis 1, that's the echo is, this is the Word who was there in the beginning and all these things, and now it's put on flesh. And I think that's what the Gospel of John is trying to tell us, is the best way to describe God is Jesus. So yeah, it's all headed to a cross and a tomb. Or if not, then if not, I'm going to quit doing this and start writing about Tennessee full time, right? Like, I mean, no joke. Like there's real life stuff in here. Anything else? I have no idea what time it is. Our kids took naps. We're good.
You want to hang around maybe a little bit?
Yes.
Visit around, and if you all have some other things to
Yes.
get out to, I know we've got choir, we might have some youth to pick up. So, but again, let's express our appreciation.